Hi everyone, this is just going to be a short little supplementary video. You're not obligated to watch it, and this material will not be required knowledge for your midterm or your final paper, though you can choose to write about it if you would like. I really just wanted to make a short video to talk about three different interpretations of Spinoza that sort of held sway for the most part after his death. And I think it's interesting because a lot of the students in the classroom, reading responses as well as talking to students in office hours, were sort of interested in this question of like, was Spinoza religious? What were Spinoza's religious beliefs like? Was Spinoza an atheist? I mentioned that in the previous video that to be accused of Spinozism was tantamount to being accused of atheism. But, to what extent is that really true? And so basically, I want to try to present three different ways that Spinoza is commonly interpreted in the history of philosophy, just to kind of give you different perspectives or points of view on the text. And so the first one that we're going to start out with, and these range from the most common in pantheism to the least common in what I'm going to call acosmism. But we can get to that in a moment. So pantheism is the way that Spinoza is sort of regularly interpreted, and this way of framing Spinoza basically pits him as an unorthodox religious figure. So he's still religious, he still believes in God, and in fact he asserts that God is the sole cause of all of his modifications. And so that seems pretty clearly religious. And so, in favor of the pantheism interpretation of Spinoza, they point out that for Spinoza, God is the sole substance of the world, and that all the things that we normally think of as finite modifications or finite substances are actually nothing but modifications of God. So, me, this pen, this paper in front of me, the whiteboard, all of these are just different ways or modes that God can appear. And so in this view, it's not like God is in heaven and his creation, the earth, is in some other plane of existence or something like that. Instead, we all directly partake in the essence of God. And so that seems to point out that God is literally everywhere. Pan just means everywhere. And so pantheism is to say that God is everywhere, and everything is equally an expression of his essence. Now, the second tradition for interpreting Spinoza, this atheistic interpretation of Spinoza, this is really going to draw on the ways that Spinoza is a challenge to orthodox religion. So the first thing I wrote here is Deus sive natura, which means God or nature. So, if you can sort of replace the word God with the word nature and say that nature is the sole substance and we're only modifications of nature, we're just ways that nature, like stardust or whatever, can appear at a certain given time and under certain conditions. And additionally, atheistic interpretations of Spinoza point out that if there's no heaven, if God doesn't speak to human beings in an individual way, there's no revelation, that there doesn't really seem to be anything like a special kind of religious knowledge that religious authority figures have that other people do not. And so in a lot of ways, Spinoza will say in the Ethics, like basically, if you want to know about God, then really you should do philosophy and science. In a lot of ways, that can strike readers as atheistic, as denying the ability of the church and religious institutions to have any significant or meaningful relationship to God. And it also seems like Spinoza's conception of God is so thinned out. God is no longer a person, God no longer delivers moral judgments, God no longer makes decisions, that it doesn't really seem like the meaning of the word God means that more than just the universe or nature. And then finally, as sort of a reaction to this atheistic interpretation of Spinoza, some later figures say it's actually not even right to say that Spinoza was a pantheist or an atheist. In fact, he wasn't saying that God is there in all of his modifications and all of the, individual finite things, but instead that there's no such thing as finite things. And that ultimately, when we think that we're dealing with finite substances, things that are independent of nature, then really we're just talking about God and one of God's manifestations. And so, in this view, it's not that Spinoza says that God exists in all of his modifications from a certain point of view, but that the modifications are really illusory, and that the fundamental nature of God is to be just this sole substance and fundamental nature of everything that is. For those of you who have a background in ancient Greek philosophy, these tend to be Eleatic interpretations of Spinoza. Or in other words, they make him like these ancient Greek philosophers who held that the universe was singular in nature, and that all of the apparent modifications to the universe were merely fake or unreal, and that the unity of nature was more important than discussing every one of its modifications. So it's not that everything is God, as in the pantheistic point of view, but that besides God, there is nothing. That there is no substantial reality outside of God, that the universe does not exist in a way independently from God. And so, really, this way of interpreting Spinoza takes him to be denying the existence of modifications of God. So, I present this not in order for you to, pick one or the other, but just to sort of present different points of view through which we can look at Spinoza. I would say that this acosmic interpretation is less popular. Part of the reason why it's less popular nowadays is because Spinoza seems pretty clear in the Letter on the Infinite, as well as the Ethics that you'll read next week, that modifications of God do exist. That there are particular things, but that he's trying to give a philosophical interpretation of their nature. And in doing so, he says that they're reliant on God, not that they don't exist. But I present this mostly just so that you can see different ways of interpreting Spinoza's God and what are the religious implications, if any, of this point of view. I think ultimately where you come down on this question depends on your starting point. If you're a Christian or you're Jewish or you're a Muslim, then you probably think that a lot of what is going on in Spinoza is fundamentally atheistic, because he's denying what you take to be essential aspects or qualities of God. Whereas, for example, if you are an atheistic and you're scientifically minded, then you might think that Spinoza is a pantheist and that we would be better off just abandoning all of this talk of God whatsoever. So that's just to say that where you come down on this question is largely a result of what you think about the world in general, and then your interpretation of Spinoza is probably going to follow from that. So these are just three different points of view that I think are historically interesting, and you all might find interesting as well. Hope you're enjoying Spinoza still. Bye.